Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Matt Schultz. I work for the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance, and you're at the Sustainable Phosphorus webinar series. The theme for today's talk is Extreme Climate, Extreme Phosphorus. And I think, as we all know, climate change is a tectonic foundational shift that has implications for all of our biological and geochemical cycles, and the phosphorus cycle is no exception to that. We've seen in North America just this summer very intense hurricane season on the eastern seaboard, wildfires all throughout the West. And these events, of course, have implications in how phosphorus moves through the environment. So we're lucky today to have two speakers who are expert on this topic. And Dr. Phil Haygarth from Lancaster University will be talking to us about these effects current and in the future in the UK context. And Dr. Laura Johnson will be speaking specifically to the context in Lake Erie. I do have a few housekeeping announcements to make before we get started in the actual presentations. First, I've noticed you've all muted yourselves and kept your screens off, which I appreciate. We want to reduce the bandwidth requirements for the events just to make sure that we're not disrupting ourselves. And we also want to keep the background noise down as much as possible. So if you could keep those features on mute, that would be great. You might notice, if you're looking at my screen now, you might notice that in your own screen, you have a ribbon. If you scroll to the bottom or possibly to the top of your screen, that looks something like this one that I'm displaying here. And you'll see there that your mute feature and your video feature are here, and your share screen feature is here. So if you need to mute yourself for some reason, you go off mute or something like that, this is where you actually put yourself back on. Also, you'll notice that there's a chat feature. And this I would encourage you to use throughout the whole presentation. This is actually how we're going to do our questions and answers rather than having people come on and off mute. I'll just ask you to send your chats to me during the course of the presentation. When your questions come up, I'll gather those, and then we'll have a Q&A session after the two presentations are done where we'll address those. What I'll actually do is I'll copy and paste your question into the PowerPoint presentation so people can see the questions that we're discussing. Just a note on the chat feature, you can select, excuse me, you can select to whom you're sending your chat with this little drop down here. And I would suggest that you pick me, Matthew Schultz, to send that chat to. You can also choose to send it to everyone if you'd like to. You could, if you want to share a link with everyone, you can do that. I just ask that you don't do any advertising or marketing through that feature. And then if you are cut off from Zoom for some reason, please just go back to the original email that I sent out that you used to log in today and try it one more time. If the whole thing collapses, we might have to wait 5 minutes or something like that to get back online. But we'll keep trying for a good 5 or 10 minutes before we give up if there should be some technical difficulty like that. I think that just about covers it. I want to make a few quick announcements. So first of all, the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance, who we are, we're a member-funded multi-stakeholder nonprofit whose mission is being North America's central forum and advocate for the sustainable use, recovery, and recycling of phosphorus in the food system. And we have a great set of founding members and partners who've contributed funds to enable presentations such as this. And we have a host of other activities. And if you would like to support us, we'd love to talk to you about joining your organization to ours through membership. And you can contact me at this email address provided on the slide if you want more information. If you're also feeling generous, we have a donate button on our webpage, and you can kick us some money that way as well. I should say that we're going to record this webinar and we'll post it on our YouTube channel. You can contact me for information about that as well, or you can go to our website and find a link to our YouTube channel there. So you can access, you'll be able to see the slides after the presentation that way if you want to get a hold of them. Just one more announcement. We have another big event coming up in February. So we now have an annual Phosphorus Forum event, and this one's going to take place in Tempe, Arizona on February 27th. Tempe is usually a great place in February, barring any problems with climate change. We should have great weather for the event. And even if we don't, we've got a great agenda. So we have a couple of great keynote speakers. Dr. Sally Rocky, who's the executive director for the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, will be there giving a keynote, as will Dr. Paul Fixon, who is now retired, was a senior vice president of the International Plant Nutrition Institute, and then onwards from there. So I think if you'd like to come to this event, we'd love to have you. It's free registration. You do have to come in person, though. We're not going to be streaming this event. And the registration is online, again, at this information that you see here. A little bit about the agenda today. We're in the midst of the introduction, just about done with that. We're first going to have a presentation by Dr. Phil Haygarth and from Dr. Laura Johnson. Those will be about 25 minutes each, and then we've allotted an equal amount of time for questions and answers at the end. So we'll have ample time for discussion at the end of the talks. I will go ahead and read these bios as the speakers come up, but I think what we can go ahead and do, Phil, if I can go ahead and stop my share and you can go ahead and pick up here with your presentation, if that's okay. Phil, you might be on mute. Yep. You're good. I'll go ahead and read Phil's bio while he's setting up his screen. Professor Phil Haygarth leads the Sustainable Catchments Research Challenge Area for Lancaster University and conducts personal research on the interface between soils and freshwaters with a focus on diffuse, particularly phosphorus pollution and runoff control. And I noticed, Phil, when I was looking at your splash screen here, which I can see well now, that you have a picture. It looks like you're barbecuing grass, and I was a little worried that things have gotten tough in the UK since Brexit.
No, it was just my son's school homework, actually. So
okay.
So can you hear me and see me okay?
I can hear you just fine, and your slides are up.
Okay, well, it's great to be here, Matt and everybody, and thank you very much. So yeah, so it's great to be contributing this from across the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is very important in this story, and the title of my presentation today is Storms, Floods, Climate Change and Phosphorus Transfer from Land to Oceans, the UK Experience. If you want to follow me on Twitter there, Prof. P. Haygarth, there's some other links as well for you to follow up with. Very happy to follow up any of these discussions with you. This is something that I'm very passionate about and it's very close to my heart. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to actually do four things. There's a picture there of a phosphorus mine in Yunnan province in China, which I took last year. But what I want to do, I want to split the talk into four areas. I'm going to give a little bit of context of phosphorus. I'm going to talk about how phosphorus transfers from land to water. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of our studies in the UK. We have this thing called the demonstration test catchments. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about a particular storm which is very close to our hearts, which wreaked havoc for us here in the northwest of England, called Storm Desmond. I'm going to tell you particularly a story around Storm Desmond. And then I'm finally going to really dig into the science and start to look ahead and do some modeling and some prediction and give you a really bleak outlook really about what the future holds. So that's it. So let's now just give a little bit of context. So here we have a great vista from China, which really sums up the phosphorus story in many ways quite simply. There we have an open cast phosphorus mine. The phosphorus, if you don't know, is mined from certain key points around the globe, and it is taken out of the mines and distributed around to help primarily drive agricultural production. It comes from one or two, three or four, just a few key locations around the world. And human beings, of course, interfere with that phosphorus cycle because it has great benefits to us for food production and other onward effects in our economy, and hence the function of the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance. But the thing that I've been working with, to move to my next slide, the thing I've been working with is really for over 25 years now is the issues surrounding how phosphorus transports itself from land to water. So, okay, so we make a choice. We take phosphorus out of the rock supplies. We put it onto our agricultural surfaces. It's fantastic at helping us produce food. It's really helped the world. It's fantastic at feeding the world. We mustn't forget that. But one of the great problems that we're also faced with is that it does transfer itself into waterways. And when it gets washed off land, when it goes to water, it causes all sorts of undesirable effects we really don't want to happen. And I know that Laura is going to talk more about some dramatic effects that have happened in her part of the world in the following presentation, so I won't dwell on that. But I want to talk about these processes first, the transfer continuum. This is how things move from land to water, how phosphorus moves. It's prone to anecdote. We all have our anecdotal understanding of what we think is happening, but it needs proper science doing. It's multidisciplinary. It involves biochemistry. It involves lots of scales, from big catchments and nations right down to the molecular scale. It's very complex, and it transcends, as I said, many scales. So we have to try and rationalize what's happening when phosphorus moves from land to water. And this is how I try and do it. This is a very simple conceptual model, which is now well proven, which I published back in 2005, which I call the transfer continuum. And it's a simple breakdown conceptually in how we understand what is happening when phosphorus leaves agricultural land and goes to water. Firstly, the farmer makes a choice. He or she buys phosphorus, probably come from one of those mines in China perhaps, and brings it into the farm that then is put onto the land. It either goes in as a fertilizer, or it could come in typically as a concentrate food that's given to the animal. So that's the source. It comes into the farm and it represents a potential for onward transport. Then we have this thing called mobilization. The phosphorus which has come into the system is potentially mobilized from the soil out into the system. Mobilization is the start of the journey from the soil. It either occurs as a solute in terms of solubilization. It can be attached to colloids or particles in a detached physical form like erosion or particle transfer, or it can actually be mobilized as an incidental loss. This is when we think of the application of manure or the fresh application of fertilizer, which is actually washed off the land directly into the river or the watercourse when it hasn't actually had a chance to become incorporated into soil. So source comes in, mobilization, start of journey from the soil in the field. Thirdly, the next part is delivery or transport. Delivery or transport represents the transfer, the transport pathways really of the phosphorus and other substances across the landscape or under the land in the hydrological pathways, the actual hydrology of the processes, the physical flows of the water that actually span out from the field and go down to water. And finally, somewhere, maybe many miles away and many years later, we have an impact. The impact could be biological or ecological. As I said, as Laura's going to talk more about that, I noticed in her slides later, it could be sociological or it could be economic. But nonetheless, we have this very complex source, mobilization, delivery and impact, which is all part of this transfer continuum of how phosphorus moves from land to water. So that's what we call the stationary condition. That's what happens, other things being equal, today. But then we have this thing coming along, which is climate change, which is changing everything. So it comes along, if you like, conceptually side on to all of this and affects all of these aspects of the processes. But particularly, I want to dwell on how it affects delivery, because I think delivery is particularly vulnerable in many respects. And this is where my research has been focused on. So let's have a look at a landscape. How are we doing, Matt? Can you hear me? Is everything good? Matt's probably on mute.
I can hear you just fine, Phil. Everything's going very well, thanks.
Oh, good. That's great. Sorry about the panic there.
That's all right. Scintillating presentation.
Okay, so here we have a landscape in northern England. It's a typical. This is probably actually taken around about this time of. No, it wasn't. It was taken in February 2016, a year and a half ago. But it looks a little bit like this today. It's very wet. A lot of the landscape has wet patches on it. Typical temperate, typical UK landscape. And this is what happens. You can start to imagine the idea of delivery of water moving across this landscape. It doesn't have to have a river channel. Here we've got a farmer here who's doing something on the landscape, but nonetheless we've got sheep grazing. Obviously there's a presence of nutrients and fertilizers driving these systems, but somehow water moves off that landscape. It leads me to what we've been doing in the UK. I just want to give you a little bit of background, if you can bear with me, folks, on a study we've called the Demonstration Test Catchments in the UK, where we've set up some catchment studies. You can read on the right-hand side all these things that we've been doing, but I'm just going to talk about these little orange blobs on the map of England and Wales here. Here in northern England, I live about here. That's where I am at the moment. Here in northern England is the River Eden, and I lead a team which has been studying the River Eden. We're part of a national demonstration test catchment programme. Here on the east of England, my colleagues work on the River Wensum, which is an arable-dominated area, a cropland area, much drier part of the world. And then in the south of England, my colleagues work on the Hampshire Avon here particularly, and on the Tamar. And their farming is mixed. They have some grassland and they have some cropland too. And as I didn't say, where I live is particularly grassland. It's forage, it's livestock and animal farming. So we've got livestock, we've got cropping, much drier climate, and then a kind of mixture here in the south. We've been working together since 2009, actually, gathering and studying and working with our communities, collecting data, doing biophysical science, but also observing what's happened. And we've had investment from the government. We've brought together communities of practice to try to unfathom these really complex and wicked problems of how phosphorus and other substances transport themselves out of agricultural land and into rivers, and how we can manage that. And we're all working on it, and we're doing our best, and we're doing some great stuff. And there's some people who have done some terrific work. And one of the things I want to draw your attention to now is some of the data that we've found for phosphorus. I mean, this isn't particularly peculiar to the work we've done, but it's a great example of really how phosphorus behaves. And I know many people around the world have found similar things. The simple thing is that my colleague Matt here led the work, and found that high magnitude events exhibited threshold-like behaviour, which resulted in vast amounts of phosphorus fluxes. In other words, this is what we call a discharge hydrograph and a chemograph, the responding total reactive phosphorus and the total phosphorus here, following the storm discharge in a particular storm as time passes from one day and to the next here. You can see that when the discharge rises, this black line rises, phosphorus, in a nutshell, tends to go with it. In other words, if you've got rainfall and runoff, phosphorus goes with it. And that makes it quite simple, or it simplifies our ability to try and model and understand what's happening. But what it means is, of course, is that when we do get the big storms like we've all been experiencing lately, then when these types of things happen, when we get big flows and big rainfalls coming, then the phosphorus tends to go too. Nitrogen does other things behave in different ways, but this is what P does. And so this gives us an ability to understand what's happening. Now then, let's change gear. This is my dog, this is my daughter, and this is my son. And just out of that picture, probably another quarter of a mile out of sight, is my house. And this photograph was taken on the 5th of December 2015, when I'd just gone out to pick my daughter up here from her drama school on a Saturday morning. And it was just shocking. The whole landscape was covered in running water. The river here, the small, we call them becks here, small rivers in our locality, in my farm, my next door neighbour's farm here had burst its banks. You can't actually see, but there was about 4 feet of water there. We actually had to walk home on this bridge. We had to wade through water. I had to carry the dog. It was all very dramatic. Parts of our house and our neighbours and many people around us were all flooded. The city of Lancaster was taken out because of the electricity station went down. This is the local river, the River Loon, which is just a few miles away. In fact, I drive over that bridge every day when I come to work. I'll be crossing that river tonight on my way home. This is the river. Normally it's just a small channel that runs down the middle here, but the whole valley was covered and the whole city was taken out. The whole region was out of electricity. It was very, very dramatic and very impactful on the community, and really quite apocalyptic-like for me as a father, as a local resident, and a professor of soil and water science to live through this. It was really quite shocking. It was very visceral, the effects of it. It was quite, it really did have a deep effect on me and the community. So let's just reflect now. I'm moving into this part of the talk where we're thinking about Storm Desmond. What happened? Well, on the 5th of December 2015, we had 34 centimetres, about just over a third of a metre of rain fell in one day nearby. That was what was measured nearby. That's one heck of a lot of rain for our part of the world. I know it's reputed to rain a lot here, but actually that's a lot of rain. And the landscape was wet. It was the fall, it was the autumn. The land couldn't cope with that water. There was nowhere it could store it, and it just ran off. There was no way we could store it. We had dramatic flooding and so on all over the place. We had a new 2-day record for another locality and so on. And let's just dwell a little bit very briefly on why this happened. Well, El Nino was particularly strong during that time of the year. It was increasing the risk of higher than average rainfall. El Nino down in the southern hemisphere, and what happened in that particular occurrence was we had some big temperatures down here in the Atlantic that actually were quite a bit higher than they normally are. So the climate, the globe was a little bit warmer, and these anomaly temperatures were about 1 to 2 degrees C higher. That means that you get a little bit more evaporation of water from the ocean, a little bit more fuel really for the storms. And this is the kind of thing that's happening. And the frontal system, the weather pattern it typically does this actually. Here we are in the UK, and we tend to get this predominant air masses moving across the Atlantic and hitting and breaking on the UK. And this particular occurrence, the storm came up here, up between Ireland and Wales and England, and broke here over western northern England. Now then, what was particularly fortuitous for me and my team working on the River Eden was that because we had the infrastructure in place, really quite miraculously, we were able to determine the phosphorus and other nutrient exports during Storm Desmond in our studies in the River Eden catchment. It was quite amazing that we were able to do that, but because we had all the kit in place, it was reasonably resilient. We did have some issues over the uncertainty of gauging the high flows, which is inevitable when a river bursts its banks. But we did capture the 24-hour hydrograph. This is the rainfall here. This is the discharge, the runoff. And here you can see the nitrate, the suspended sediment, and the phosphorus proceeding through that storm. Now, what we found was quite dramatic. Here's the sediment, the total phosphorus, the total reactive phosphorus, and the nitrate. And what we found was in that 1 24-hour period, this is a percentage of a normal annual export for the previous annual phase. So sediment, total P, total reactive P, and nitrate ranged between 8 and 22% of the total annual loss was lost in just one day. So get that. So in the case of total phosphorus, we lost 8 to 12% of the annual loss in one day, measured in Storm Desmond. That wasn't modelled, that's what we found. That's 1/10 of the annual loss was measured in that one event. So we were, we were lucky to be able to measure that. And I would say that's probably an underestimation because of the gauging issues that we had. Now, it also did some dramatic things to the riverbed. So here's the phytobenthos. Here's some pictures of the riverbed pre-Storm Desmond here of the riverbed. And then after Storm Desmond in December, it had really been scoured out and cleaned off. 72% reduction in biomass concentrations after Storm Desmond and 91% reduction in winter biomass on the riverbed after the storm had passed. So now I'm going to go to the final part, but perhaps the most intellectually challenging part of my presentation, which is now to think about the actual looking ahead and what all this means. I've told you about phosphorus, source, mobilisation, delivery, impact, the transfer continuum. I've told you about the demonstration test catchments, which we were lucky to have in place in the UK. And I've told you about Storm Desmond and what it did. So I've told you a story so far. Now, I happened to be lucky at the time because I was leading and have just finished leading a team which was funded by our research council on changing water cycle. It was actually challenged before Storm Desmond came to look at the effect of climate change on nutrient transfers in the future and what is going to happen to nutrient export from land to water in the future. I'm going to give you some little some insights that we've gained from this project. Now, of course, doing this kind of work requires prediction. It requires modelling, and with that, it's extremely challenging. And before I go much further, I want to say that requires uncertainty and tolerances. It's difficult to do prediction. And I think that's important that you get that message when we go forward. So firstly, let's just think about the rainfall. So here's some historical and future predictions of the River Eden. This is the catchment that I study in northwest England. Well, here, historically, in my lifetime, I was born in the 1960s, we have already measured a 31% increase in winter rainfall and a 16% decrease in summer rainfall. Now that, in a way, sums it up, because that's the way the future here at the bottom that's why the future models, forgive me, I'll go back to that slide. The future models are also confirming that. They're suggesting winter increases in precipitation of up to 17% and summer decreases by up to 26%. Overall, actually, the net rainfall will probably balance out. There'll be no more or no less. I'm talking in general terms here. But we're going to see a much more concentrated effort of rainfall shift distribution to larger events in the winter time. And that's what we're set to get in my part of the world. And that led us to a paper which you can access for yourself. It's all published online. We're very proud of this paper. I would say it's my best work so far in my career. I think this team did a great job. I was very proud to be associated with it. And what we have determined is, you can read the paper for yourself, I'm going to take you through it now, is really major agricultural changes will be required to mitigate phosphorus losses under climate change. Now then, it's going to get a little bit more technical now and explain to you how we got to this. So firstly, in order to determine what the climate change is going to do, you have to be able to model the current condition of today. And the first thing we wanted to do was try out all the existing models, the catchment models for modeling the phosphorus that existed. And to cut a very long story short, we ended up actually only using 2 models. We wanted to use more, but we only felt we could use 2 with any confidence. And this is the hydrological predictions of the environment, the HYPE model, and contrasted very nicely with a data-based mechanistic style of approach, which was a transfer function model, which actually benefited from the high temporal resolution data that we had actually derived from the catchment. So we had 2 modelling approaches, which we were able to use. In other words, to reduce some of the uncertainty by using 2 models and not just 1. And the bit in red here, perhaps just take it, let's just dwell on that for a moment. we were able to do the modelling because of the dominant effect of rainfall in driving diffuse phosphorus loads is shown by the relationship between annual rainfall and annual P load, where annual rainfall explains 60% in the River Wensum, 63% in the Hampshire Avon, that's the one in the south of England, and 82% here in the northwest of England in the wet Eden. In other words, you can see these relationships here. So what we were able to do was use the fact that we know there's a relationship between rainfall and load to build on the modelling. And different parts of the world, depending on how much rainfall there are, vary in their response to that. But we were able to use that as a basis to proceed. So here, there's lots and lots of information, and it's very difficult to summarise it. So if you just don't be overwhelmed with what you see on the slides, just try to listen to what I say. So firstly, this is the future predicted phosphorus emissions for the 2050s based on a high scenario. We had a number of scenarios. You can look at all the scenarios you want in the paper. They're all covered there. But the key thing is that the trends in the medium winter phosphorus load show an increase for all three catchments in the UK by the 2050s. We're showing an increase in phosphorus emissions by around 30% in the Eden and around and the Avon, and around 10% in the River Wensum. That's the drier cropland in the east. So a lesser input where there's a less of a rainfall input in the east. But nonetheless, the models are showing an overall input in winter P load. Okay, and in contrast, the summer phosphorus exports show a decrease in all the catchments by up to 20%. Although the contributions of the summer load to the annual load is very small. And the point overall is it's the winter that dominates, and therefore the main point is that there are going to be overall net increases because the winter discharge is key. Okay, so it's going to increase, folks. Next slide. So this is another way of showing it. So on the left is the three database modelling approaches, and on the right is the HYPE modelling approach. In other words, two modelling approaches and then three catchments. So a lot of information, and then we have the winter and the summer discharge, and then we have the base condition, the high scenario in the 2050s and the high scenario in the 2080s shown here. So what's happening today, what's happening in 2050s predicted, what's happening in 2080s. And you can sort of eyeball the responses here in the winter and the summer. Another way of looking at it is shown in that state. A lot of information, a lot of work done by Mary, my postdoc, and the team that did a fantastic job on this. But the estimates for present day conditions and future conditions are representing the 2050s, 2080s from the high emission scenarios of climate rainfall in the future. So that's another way of looking at the data. So, okay, so what I've shown you so far, bear with me, folks, there's a lot to take on here. I'm just trying to simplify it. I've shown you, in a nutshell, that we've measured increases in winter rainfall already. I've shown you that we've measured really high emissions of phosphorus during big storms, and we've predicted using two models and with a lot of rigor and a lot of fine resolution data. We've been able to predict that the winter emissions of phosphorus will increase, and the overall net input to phosphorus looks like it's going to increase too. So what happens? That's just what the climate's going to do. What then happens if we put agricultural change on top of that? And we thought about this, and we worked with the stakeholders and the catchment managers and the farmers, and we tried to work out what would happen in these catchments in the future. And it was, you know, folks, it was really complicated, and it's so complex that in the end, what we decided to do is what we did in the middle here, is we represented the agricultural changes as degrees of intensification of agricultural phosphorus practices. And we simply said the future will look somewhere in this zone from plus or minus 20%, plus or minus 50, plus or minus 80% increase or decrease in phosphorus inputs. In other words, we drove the future of those models by varying the inputs the inputs by increasing or decreasing phosphorus in the future. So we tried to cover the ranges of phosphorus inputs driving those systems in the future. And to cut a long, very complicated and story short, in this slide, this is showing the phosphorus under agricultural change, and the horizontal line represents the present day annual load, mean of all types of runs. And the conclusion was large reductions in phosphorus in the range of 20 to 100% will be required to offset the projections of the increased annual load due to climate change in the 2050s. Okay, so it's perhaps not surprising, but the climate is going to change the system to the degree that we're going to have to really change the manage the agriculture to a very high degree to make any difference. It's quite dramatic, really. So putting this in context, and I've nearly finished, Matt, reductions in phosphorus inputs in all catchments that we studied would be required to offset the increase resulting from climate change. A reduction in phosphorus inputs of at least 80% would be required in the Avon, that's in the south, around a 20% reduction in the Wensum, that's in the east of England, the cropland, and around about a 30% reduction in the Eden to maintain phosphorus losses from the catchments at the present day levels. So the wider conclusions, it's difficult to predict phosphorus transfers to catchments, and there is much uncertainty associated with that. Actually, it's difficult to model it under the stationary condition today. So bearing all that in mind, and bearing in mind the difficulties of predicting climate change as well, we show that predicted increase in winter phosphorus loads due to climate change is greater than the technically feasible reduction from mitigation measures estimated in previous studies. On large-scale agricultural changes, only large-scale changes between 20 and 80% will limit the projected impacts of climate change on phosphorus loads in these catchments. And I ask folks, are we prepared for this? I don't think we are. I think this is coming upon us very quickly. We need to get together some fast thinking to adapt. Thanks to a great team effort, this is the main team that drove the modelling, but others also contributed. Thank you very much indeed. There you go. So I'm going to hand over now to Matt. And
great. And thank you. Thank you, Phil. It was a great presentation, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions coming over the wire. Again, if people want to submit their questions, please do so using the chat feature in Zoom. You should see a little chat button at the bottom of the ribbon that you'll see if you scroll to either the bottom or top of your Zoom window. And if you hit that, you can address your chats to me, Matthew Schultz. I'll capture those questions, and then when we get to the questions and answers, I'll post them up on the slides for discussion. Laura, do you want to go ahead and take control?
I can do that.
For your slides, and in the meantime, I'll go ahead and read a bit of bio information. So Dr. Laura Johnson is director of the National Center for Water Quality Research at Heidelberg University in Ohio, where she investigates factors that influence water quality of rivers and creeks. Laura received her PhD from University of Notre Dame in 2008 and was a postdoctoral research associate at Indiana University in Bloomington prior to moving to Tiffin in 2013. And we're fortunate to have you here, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone.
I see your screen, and I can hear you too.
Wonderful. And do you see a little laser pointer too?
I see that as well. That's a neat little feature.
Great. Wonderful. Okay. So, yeah, well, thanks everyone for being on the webinar, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Honestly, I haven't done as in-depth as studies on the impacts of climate change on a nutrient runoff like Phil has done, but rather I've taken this opportunity to sort of pull together all of my thoughts that I have been having about this based off of some of the observations and studies that we've had in the region already. So I think that there's some insights that really build off of what Phil has shown. To clarify, as Matt said, I'm from Heidelberg University, which is in Ohio, not Heidelberg University, or University of Heidelberg, which is in Germany. It's a bit confusing, but our founders of the university decided to name the university after Heidelberg in Germany, and so here we are. You can see this map here shows where we're located, which is basically north central Ohio. Okay, so like I said, I'm working around the Great Lakes region. I'm going to talk specifically about Lake Erie, but I wanted to start by showing at first just a map of the Great Lakes. If you're somewhat unfamiliar with them, you know, there's 5 Great Lakes that make up essentially parts of the boundaries between the US and Canada up here in the upper Midwest. And most of my focus will be in Lake Erie, which happens to be the southernmost of the Great Lakes. It's also the shallowest, and thereby it's also the warmest. All of these things come together to make it more susceptible to some of the algal blooms and hypoxia issues that we see today. But for the whole Great Lakes region, there's already been quite a bit of study looking at how climate change has influenced various factors. And so what you can see here is that, you know, that we already have found increases in temperature, total precipitation, heavy storm precipitation, as well as the number of frost-free days in a given season. So these things have increased, you know, some of them fairly dramatically, but then also there's been even bigger decrease in the Great Lakes ice coverage, which has a whole lot of influence over the climate and the local weather in this region, particularly when we think of winter snowfall. These lakes produce quite a bit of lake effect snow as the weather patterns move across the region, and typically Michigan and areas like Buffalo get hit pretty hard. Upper Peninsula of Michigan gets hit even harder, I think. This information is all coming from the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment, which is essentially a group that pulls all of this information together. But what I'm going to focus on today is Lake Erie. More specifically, I'm going to be talking a lot about the Western Lake Erie Basin, because that is where most of the nutrients that enter Lake Erie come from. And within the Western Lake Erie Basin, almost the entire land area is made up of the Maumee River. So you can see a watershed map of that here. For those of you who are familiar with the area, the Maumee River flows through Toledo. The headwaters, 2 of the main tributaries come together in Fort Wayne. So, you know, it's a funny looking watershed because it's very flat here and made up of a lot of glacial moraines, but that's what I'll be focusing on quite a bit today. So all the figures I'll show will be primarily focused on there. So when we look at the Maumee River, we find similar results as that overall assessment for the Great Lakes. First one being the increased intensity of precipitation in the region. This is a figure for the Maumee River for a precipitation gauge, basically smack dab right in the middle of it, that shows the cumulative days with greater than 2 inches of precipitation from the early 80s through 2014. And if you add these all up, what you see is that there were 8 events in the first 16 years, and we've had over 20 events since then. And that doesn't even include 3 events that occurred just in the summer of 2015. So this increased intensity of precipitation is something that is talked about a lot in this region. It's something that farmers are noticing as well. Even though typically in our area, the phrase climate change is not something we say outright as much. So this is something that's occurring, and it's starting to have some influence on the Maumee River. Now, these are trend plots. You don't see any of the raw data here. This is from an analysis that Craig Stowe with NOAA did with us on our data, and some of this is USGS and NOAA data. But basically to do a seasonally decomposed trend analysis for things like precipitation and discharge, which you see both have increased since the mid-90s. Discharge has a slightly higher proportional increase than precipitation does. So some of these effects are showing up in our waters as well. What's interesting, though, is that we don't see similar trends for every month of the year. So, like I said, we do these seasonally decomposed models, so you can see how the trends change by month. And the straight line here is essentially that long-term average. So we see is, not so much for precipitation, but very much so for discharge. There's certain months like March and May and December where we've seen very big increases in flow when basically these are periods of time, particularly March and May, when we don't really want to have those increases in flow occurring over this period of time. But similarly, we see in the summer times, there's been decreases in flow, which really line up well with some of our very dry, more drought-like conditions that we see in those periods of time now. So some of the effects that we would expect out of climate change, we're really starting to see in some of these trends. But we can look at this also another way and start to add in some phosphorus here. So our increase in discharge, as you can see it here, this is a slightly different format. So now you're seeing all of the raw data for the Maumee River as an annual discharge. This line is the 5-year running average, and there is a definite increase here in the 2000s. We tend to see cyclical discharge anyway, just based off of weather patterns. But what's interesting is that we haven't seen very much of a decrease in this discharge that we would have expected to see by now. But this increase was also concurrent with increases in flow weighted mean concentrations. So this would be, essentially an annual mean concentration for dissolved phosphorus over the period of record in which we've been monitoring phosphorus in the Maumee River. You can see that goes back to 1974, and I think I have data going up to 2014, it appears. But if we multiply these two together, we can look at this in a slightly different format. And this is an effort that was led by Helen Jarvey, who is also a part of our Phosphorus Sustainability Network. And basically all she did, it was kind of remarkably simple. She took every day's load and added it together over the whole period of record and noted that there were two major switch points and how quickly loading would increase. And so essentially you can see there are these two periods of time here where we had much higher loading accumulating over this period of time. It slowed down a bit through the 80s to the 2000s, and then it increased again. And you can see that is associated both with changes in discharge as well as the changes in the concentrations. So to take this the next step, what we really wanted to know is, well, are we seeing these increasing loads simply because we have higher flow? Or are we seeing an increasing load because of other changes on the landscape as well? So it's something aside from just a climate change expectation here. And so what she's showing here is essentially the relationship between SRP load and flow. And you can see that there has been a shift up from this mid 80s up to 2003 to 2013. So our most recent time period, meaning that we're seeing more loading for a given flow than we used to have back in the 80s when we really didn't have many of bloom problems in the mid 90s, for instance. And she did a very savvy type of calculation looking at the relationships between concentration and flows and applying that from the old model to the new model to assess how much of this runoff volume is, higher runoff volume is leading to the increased loading, and found that really it's only accounting for about 35%. So why are we seeing such increased SRP loading or DRP loading, whichever one you like? We think this really has to go back to changes that we've seen on the landscape. In this region, there used to be very intense tillage through the 80s. At that time, to reduce the particulate phosphorus losses and to improve soil quality, everything moved over to more of a conservation tillage with high residue management. So anything that was going on, didn't till nearly as much, didn't turn the soil over. But what we think happened since then, and since the 90s, is that we've seen a development in stratification of phosphorus in the soil, even under these scenarios. And so this is basically a very simplified diagram showing soil test phosphorus throughout the Sandusky River watershed, so one of the Western Lake Erie Basin watersheds, where, if we had a 0 to 8 inch core, we're right where we're supposed to be at 36 ppm of malic. However, that if we break it into smaller increments and look at just the top 2 inches, then instead almost all of that phosphorus is really just in the top 2 inches, and that if we break it even further, that a lot of that phosphorus is hovering in that top 1 inch. And this is a concern because that's where rainwater really interacts, and we think that that has been what has enhanced some of the phosphorus runoff that we see in our watersheds. So, but let's take it a step back and think more along the lakes. There's a nice diagram here that Hans Perl put out that shows, all of the different possible interactions that could be enhancing, particularly cyanobacteria blooms in various lakes, right? I added a hypoxic zone down here because I want to talk about that too. So we covered that we have increased flows. We're seeing we have pretty substantial loadings that come into the lake. We know that these can stimulate blooms. What I didn't talk about was, there's also drought, and we expect to have bigger and longer dry periods, just like Phil had talked about, which would lead to a lower flow during some periods of time, which can enhance the stratification. Combined with our increased air temperatures, we think that we could see higher temperatures, higher stratification, building these blooms up, but also enhancing the hypoxic zone that can develop in the deeper areas of these lakes, where basically we're talking about areas that don't really have any oxygen because they're cut off from the rest of the lake. So all of these scenarios, especially if you have a harmful algal bloom, they lead to shading and outcompeting other more beneficial algal species that can have food web effects. So there's bigger scale issues here. So I want to show a little bit about how tightly linked our river is to the lake, and then some of these influences that drought and hypoxia might be having already. So we already know that what's coming from the Maumee River really drives the size of blooms that we see in Lake Erie. So here are a couple of pretty dramatic photographs. You can see 2011 was a really big bloom. It used to be the largest one that we'd ever seen. Then we had 2015, which was even bigger. And then right after 2011, we had a very dry year, and we really didn't have much of a bloom at all. You can see a little bit of a bloom here, and this is where the Maumee River is coming in, and that's where we tend to see blooms form under those smaller years. If we look at our dissolved phosphorus loading as well as discharge during that time period, we find that it's really the March through July time period that's driving the size of these blooms. So you can see 2011 to 2012, we went from a fairly high loading and discharge to a very low loading and discharge. What's interesting here is that when we look at the annual loading and discharge between these 2 years, they were almost exactly the same. So it really pointed us to the fact that there's limited time windows that really matter for the development of these really big blooms. We also see a very similar scenario from 2015 to 2016. I'm not going to show you the satellite images here, but essentially it followed suit. We had a very similar, very big bloom and very little bloom for those 2 years as well. So we had a couple of really nice natural experiments there. This is the information that's used to develop the forecast that we have right now in terms of the size of the bloom. And these are just some of the relationships. We have discharge, total phosphorus, dissolved phosphorus, and a calculated value of total bioavailable phosphorus. This is just for March through June, and it's versus, this is called CI max. Essentially, NOAA takes that satellite image and uses the light absorbances and reflectivity to determine the cyanobacterial index and give a number to the bloom size and its intensity. And so that's what this number is here. And you can see these relationships are actually really good, except for a couple of outlier years. 2012 was one of them, where we got a higher bloom than we would have expected. And 2015, we didn't get nearly as big of a bloom as we would have expected. But we think other things were limiting the bloom size that year, specifically turbidity, that the stormy water that was coming in so late into the summer really influenced the potential growth of these blooms. Just because a lot of people are usually interested in this, 2017, this is where we kind of ended up with the harmful algal bloom. We had 512 metric tons of total bioavailable phosphorus from March through July, which is higher than many other years that we've had, but not quite as high as 2015. You can see this is a bloom severity index, so we take that cyanobacterial index and put it on a slightly different scale so the public can understand it a little bit better. You can see 2011 to 2012, 2015 to 2016, and here we are here in 2017. The bloom severity index is an 8, very similar to 2013, and this red bar here is what we had forecast. There's an ensemble forecast with 4 different institutions that develop where we think we would be based off of the phosphorus loading that we collect at Heidelberg. And you can see we're on the higher end of that range, but well within the forecast. We had more July storms than we were predicted to have when we developed the forecast. So here's what the bloom looked like this year. This was the peak extent was September 23rd. And you can see, that's quite a picture, I think. It shows some really interesting things here. The first thing is the bloom tends to maintain itself in the Western Lake Erie Basin. As time goes by, if the water is warm enough, sometimes it does move its way over here. This is where Cleveland is, but we rarely see much of a bloom in the Central Basin or the Eastern Basin. Instead, the Central Basin is where we tend to get the low oxygen hypoxia issues. But the one other interesting thing here is that this was really late for our peak bloom extent. Normally we have that quite early, but this year we had an extended we had an extended hot period in the middle of September that really spurred the bloom on. So we had more going on late September and went far later into October than we would have expected. If you went into this region here, where it's kind of curling in like that, this is what an aerial photograph looked like. So if you flew your plane over it, you can see these are big blooms. Even though this might not look big, it's hard to have an area understanding of that. So, and then these are pretty scummy and very gross. Kind of look like some of those green health drinks that some of us enjoy every once in a while, but I wouldn't recommend drinking this water. Another interesting thing from this year is that we had a bloom form in the Maumee River in downtown Toledo. Basically the river flow got so low, and the way that the winds were blowing in the Lake Erie, basically it made the Maumee River be like a lake, and it formed its own bloom. So, you know, when you first look at this, it kind of looks like it's a roadway and these are parking areas and this is a nice green grassy field, but rather this is the river and these are docks, and it was very difficult for them to have their events on the river during this period of time. So why are we seeing these issues? Where is this phosphorus coming from? Well, in the Maumee River, a vast majority of the phosphorus is coming from land runoff. You can see we've done these sort of mass balance studies working with Ohio EPA, and 87% of the total phosphorus is coming from non-point sources, which is really land runoff. The rest of these percentages are showing home sewage or home septic treatment systems. So any sort of failing septics, that tends to be an issue in rural areas. And then everything else is permitted wastewater, like wastewater treatment plants, industrial, or combined sewer overflows. And they really make up a fairly minor part of the total phosphorus coming out of the Maumee. And if we think of the land runoff, when we look at a land use map for the Maumee River, this is the Sandusky River as well, you can see it's all yellow. So it's almost all agricultural. There's some urban areas. As we move up to this higher area up here, this is where Detroit is. This is Toledo, Fort Wayne. So we're talking about lots of agriculture, and our agriculture tends to be very intense row crops. So soybeans, corn, and on a very minor basis, but sometimes we see some wheat as well. We're hoping that will increase so we can improve some of our winter cover. And so let's think about how climate change might influence some of this runoff when we start to get into some of our agricultural fields. These are a couple of pictures from Kevin King's Edge of Field sites. You can see that he works with USDA. He has over 40 fields, I think about 40 fields across central and northwest Ohio where he's doing this type of monitoring. And you can see he monitors the surface runoff as well as stuff that's coming through our subsurface tile drainage, which is a necessity in northwest Ohio. Otherwise, we would still be the Great Black Swamp. And so he's been doing all of these measurements over time, and what he finds in general is that the surface runoff tends to have higher phosphorus concentrations than the tile runoff, both in terms of dissolved phosphorus and total phosphorus. You can see a box plot of all of his data across multiple years here. So it's very much summarized, but you get the general gist here. But if we look at the actual loadings, here this is showing all of the fields that he has data for that is enough to have an actual mean annual number. This is dissolved phosphorus loading. The black part is the tile drainage and the white part is surface. That except for these couple of very high losses here, almost all of his fields, there's a few other exceptions here, but a vast majority of them have most of their loading for dissolved phosphorus coming out of subsurface drainage, which kind of goes against the typical understanding of how tile drainage is supposed to work. And we could talk about in more depth after this talk, why that might be happening. So what I would be concerned about if we have these increasing intense storm events is that we could be pushing towards seeing more saturated ground that can't handle that amount of water, and then even more surface runoff than we would have before. More surface runoff means higher concentrations and potentially higher loading as we shift into a higher concentration with the same amount of flow or even more flow coming off of these fields. So climate change has a very high potential effect on this type of agricultural system. But I want to also talk a little bit more about the lake here. This is showing the hypoxic events or extent over time. And you can see that it was high, came down from the 90s to the 2000s and has since increased. What's intriguing here is 2012 is the highest extent that's been observed so far. And if you remember, that's when we had our drought. That's when we had a very low bloom year, and we didn't have a whole lot of rain. And the reason we saw such a big hypoxic event is because there was not very much discharge coming in. The weather was very calm. There wasn't a chance for a whole lot of mixing in the lake. And so it settled, you know, and it was very, very warm. So all of these things led to a deep stratification and a lot of low oxygen in the bottom of the central basin. If we had more drought, moving from high intense events and then into a late summer drought, we could have this chance for a weather whiplash. Now, I know this isn't phosphorus, so I apologize to the organizers here, but this is some data out of Iowa showing in an event in 2013 where it was a very droughty conditions, and then they ended up having very high rainfall. So you can see the cumulative discharge here in 2013 it was on the high end, but it didn't end up out of historical limits or outside of other recent years. But cumulative nitrate fluxes were far and above anything that had been observed in the Iowa River. If you remember, Iowa is also the place where they've been challenged but with high nitrate concentrations in their drinking water plants for quite some time. And the reason this occurred was because that drought led to lower uptake of the nitrate that had been applied by crops. And so when there was more application on top of that wasn't accounted for, on top of a lot of precipitation, there were these huge fluxes that were way higher than what you would normally expect for this region. Now, I don't see any reason why this could not happen with phosphorus as well if phosphorus isn't properly being managed. So we have this higher chance for, for this type of weather whiplash and these sort of intense rain to drought conditions and back and forth. So I'm pretty much out of time, so I want to wrap this up real quick. And I said a lot of things. I want to try and put them together into one thing here. So what I said is that we have found and we're expecting more increases in intense rain, which could lead to, we would expect would lead to increased flow, but could also increase phosphorus concentrations if we start seeing that shift to more surface runoff from our agricultural fields. The combined effect of these is increased phosphorus loads, which would increase algal blooms in the lake. But we also think on the flip side, we're going to be seeing an increased probability of droughts in late summer as well. Because of that, we're going to see these calm winds, decreased flow that's going to stabilize the lake and lead to an increased hypoxia. Now, this hypoxia has to be fed by something. So really it's the flipping between increased intense rain and drought where we have more P loads and more algal blooms that could then lead to the increased hypoxia. Without both of these, we probably wouldn't see quite as big of an increase. But to put them both together, we could also expect the flipping between the two to increase weather whiplash, which would further link these processes, increase phosphorus concentrations, and lead to more feedback here. Just a little bit on potential practices that could help this. You know, the first thing is to think about nutrient management. The 4 R's of nutrient stewardship in terms of how you would apply fertilizer, particularly not over applying, so using the right rate, and then trying to get it off the surface, I think would make a big difference in these watersheds. So this is really important. But I also think knowing that we're seeing such changes in hydrology, considering changing and monitoring and managing water better, you know, using something like a controlled drainage structure or other drainage water management like blind inlets or wetlands or 2-stage ditches, I think these are all really important factors to consider. But things like cover crops that increase soil organic matter on the field so it can hold on to more water, I think play an important role. But I put all of these sort of overlapping because we have to remember if we do one of these things without the others, we probably will not actually get that far. So for instance, if we don't manage our phosphorus very well on the land, then we can do all we want with cover crops and we might not actually see any change in phosphorus loading. We have to do them both together and concurrently to be able to see the big effects. So with that, I just have a little final slide while we can switch over the sharing.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Laura. That was fantastic. And I will go ahead and put up the PowerPoint slides, and we'll go ahead and start a little bit of a discussion. Sorry, I'm terrible at multitasking, so I'm going to try to do 2 things at once, which is a lot for my brain to handle. So we'll have a bit of discussion, and then we've got a question or 2 that's come in from some of the audience participating. But maybe I can kick us off here. I guess my first question would be for Phil. You outlined a kind of a dire scenario and really kind of provide a call to action for us, Phil. What happens next, and how do we use the information that you've provided and translated into a plan of action?
Yeah, that's a big question, Matt, and the truth is we're still thinking about that. It's pretty new information, and do you know what I think? I think it's very complex. It involves agricultural management, it involves river management, it involves planning landscapes. I think we need to get some communities, some stakeholder groups together. We actually need to just sit down and deal with this information. This is quite shocking, really, the implications of what we've found. I could say things like, we need to reduce phosphorus emissions even more, but I realise that it's far more complex. I mean, I just noticed on chat that someone put a very pertinent point up that we've still got to produce food. Well, we have. So, Matt, it's complicated. It's tricky. We've got to sit down some multidisciplinary teams with lots of skills of governance, of producing food, of managing rivers, of planners, and we've all got to work this out together. We need politicians on board with us. We've got to face some realities, and we need to start talking. I could prescribe all sorts of best management practices, and of course we should slow down the flow. We should be aware of all of this, but actually we just need to really take this, we need to get the message out and start talking. That's what we need to do first.
Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think first step is being aware of the potential issue, and then the gravity of that. And I know that there's a lot of talk already in Lake Erie watershed that, oh yeah, well, we want to reach these reductions, but we know we might not get it every year because of these different events. But if every year are these events, then we need to be prepared for what that could mean. So yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if either or both of you could speculate a little on the non-agriculture sectors and what sorts of challenges they're going to face. So I'm thinking stormwater managers or manure managers or water resource recovery facilities, or wastewater treatment plants, as they're also known. Do you have any thoughts on those?
Yeah, it's Phil. So absolutely. So I think part of the challenges, Matt, is that phosphorus, unfortunately, for us, we're all interested in phosphorus, isn't the main thing on everyone's agenda. It's very important, and we know that it helps us produce food. But actually, there are other things that are probably more important, like water and clean water in itself, like food production and so on. So I think what we need to do is be smart to realize that actually we ain't going to change the world by saying to the world, look at phosphorus and climate change. It's phosphorus and climate change and flooding and water management and manure management. So we've got to get these communities of practices together that cut across governances and cut across disciplines, that will start to make a difference. Because these environmental issues, that impact on people's lives, most of the people, mostly, where I live, they wouldn't have been thinking about phosphorus when they got flooded in Storm Desmond. They were thinking about, where they were getting their electricity from, or why they were flooded. Phosphorus is kind of a secondary thing. So we've got to communicate that smartly. That's what I think. I think with the issues around eutrophication, around Toledo, around the lakes, that's perhaps a bit more connected. I think it's perhaps a bit easier for Laura to communicate those issues because people really feel that and they see that themselves. It's all about getting groups together and communicating, I think.
Yeah, great.
And I could add specifically for the urban issues, I feel like it's always it's so hard to sort of plan ahead for what that's going to be. And there's some efforts to do that in terms of, these long-term plans that cities have to develop, and implementing green infrastructure is a big part of a lot of these cities. And I can list off what all of those are, but I'm sure that a lot of the folks on here have heard a lot of that stuff. But what it feels like to me is there's going to be an awful lot of sort of chasing where things are really getting and how bad it really is. So, we're good for now, but then now we tend to get these higher rain events. We need to have bigger storage systems for combined sewer overflows, or we need to have even more pervious surfaces rather than impervious, and more inputs into that. So, but it does feel like the urban sector is able to sometimes respond sooner than some of the agriculture because it's not quite as fast and diffuse. So.
Right. And maybe a stronger regulatory impetus, at least here, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Laura, you also mentioned about 2/3 way through your talk, you're going over some data from Kevin King's fields, and you were talking about the predominance of subsurface drainage, and mentioned that you might want to return to that afterwards. And I just kind of wanted to give you a chance to address that a little more in depth.
Well, sure. Yeah. I think that is specifically the idea that with the subsurface drainage that you would have any dissolved phosphorus loading coming out of there, or increases that we've seen in the recent past, because the typical understanding and kind of what the data show is that usually if you have subsurface drainage and tile drains, that the phosphorus is cleaned out a little bit, right? What we think is happening in this region is that because of our soil types, we're developing these essentially preferential flow paths, which I think is fairly common in lots of places, that is leading to a lot of these losses. And we are even finding sometimes fairly high particulate phosphorus losses through these tile drains, which, like I said, is a little bit unheard of. And it's a bit nuanced and very specific sort of pathways for phosphorus to be getting out of fields. But, that was the thing. I was like, well, if people are really interested in that very specific thing, then that's why we think stratification plays a role at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We have, I think, just Phil, you've already addressed one of the questions that came in over the chat, but we have another one here that I'll go ahead and I'll put up on the screen. I think I have to get out of, oops, I think I have to get here in order to do it, and I'll just go ahead and paste it so everyone can see the question. So do you think the climate change can impact the internal phosphorus loading in lakes as well? Does anyone want to tackle that one?
I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, is the answer to that. I think that there's two ways that it can impact internal phosphorus loading. The one of them is we have those low oxygen zones, like the hypoxic zones. That's where usually phosphorus starts to become dissociated, especially if it's iron bound. And then in the fall, when the lakes will mix, that's when we can see blooms show up in response to that. So, if we have more intense hypoxic areas and more material going into that hypoxic area, there's no reason why we wouldn't think that would increase it. But we also know that even where it's relatively oxic, like the Western Basin is too shallow to really stratify, there's been some studies that have taken cores to see just that diffusive phosphorus loss, and that is can be very heavily phosphorus driven. And some studies out of University of Toledo have identified a breakpoint in temperature that if water temperatures get closer to 30 degrees C, which is very warm, I can't imagine it's going to get quite that warm, but if it does, then we start to see order of magnitude increases in internal loading. Right now in Lake Erie, internal loading is probably only 3 to 7% of the loading that's coming in externally, but an order of magnitude increase means that it is could be a very huge deal. There's no reason to think that any of these scenarios would not be happening in other lakes. We know that those warm, stagnant lakes seem to be where we get a lot of blooms.
Yeah, sure. Okay, great. We don't, I think that's the questions that we have. So I think we can go ahead and give everyone back the rest of the time, but and give you two your time back as well. I really appreciate the thought and effort that went into putting these presentations together, and for you, I want to thank you both for joining us today. And also, I'm glad to see both a lot of familiar names and new names on the roster for the participants today. That's exactly what we'd like to see. So I want to thank everyone for participating. Before we close out, I want to also remind everyone about our Phosphorus Forum, which is happening on February 27th, and you can please visit our website to get some more information on that. It should be a great event, and if you're interested in the topics talked about today or other aspects of particularly phosphorus and agricultural system, which is where we're focused for this particular forum, you might find this to be a great event to attend. So I hope you will consider joining us. And with that, I'll say thank you. We will again be posting this up on our YouTube channel, so you can look for it there in coming days. You can also find us on LinkedIn and on Twitter if you want to follow us. And I look forward to seeing you all online for our next webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you.